My son didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He just looked at me across the dinner table, shrugged, and said calmly, "Mom, you eat for free here." For a moment, no one spoke. My granddaughter lowered her eyes. My daughter-in-law gave a small, uncomfortable laugh, and I felt something inside my chest grow very quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, excused myself from the table, walked into the hallway, and made one silent phone call. "Charles," I said softly when the line picked up, "I think it's time." And in that moment, everything began to change. If you've ever been hurt by someone you trusted, you'll understand why this story matters. Before we go further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. And I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below and tell me. Sometimes knowing someone else is listening makes all the difference. The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely arrives the way people imagine. It doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it's delivered quietly over mashed potatoes and roasted chicken in the calm voice of your own son. Michael Wright was 39 years old when he told me I ate for free in his house. And if someone had asked me 10 years earlier whether that moment could ever exist, I would have laughed at the idea. Because Michael had once been the boy who cried when he scraped his knee and ran straight into my arms. My name is Joan Wright. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I had done at least one thing right raising a good man. For 42 years, my husband Arthur and I lived in a modest brick house on a quiet street outside Cleveland. It wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't luxurious, but every corner of it carried a memory. The oak tree in the backyard that Arthur planted the year Michael was born. The faded pencil marks on the kitchen wall where we measured Michael's height every birthday. The creaky wooden stairs Arthur always promised he'd fix, but never quite got around to. Arthur used to say a home wasn't the walls, it was the years inside them. Arthur Wright was the careful one in our marriage. An engineer by profession, he believed in plans, backup plans, and then one more plan in case the first two failed. While I spent 35 years teaching second graders how to read and tie their shoes, Arthur spent those same decades designing bridges and worrying about things collapsing. But in our home, nothing ever felt like it would collapse. Michael grew up loved, supported, and encouraged. When he struggled with math in middle school, Arthur sat at the kitchen table night after night helping him. When Michael wanted to attend Ohio State for business school, we quietly took money from our savings to help cover what scholarships didn't. We never considered it a sacrifice. That's what parents do. Michael was ambitious, though not always careful. In his late 20s, he tried to start a small logistics company with a friend. It failed within 2 years, leaving him with debt and embarrassment. Arthur and I helped him through that too, though we never told anyone outside the family. Arthur said something to me during that time that I didn't think much about then. "Helping someone stand up is good," he told me one evening while we washed dishes, "but if you carry them too long, they may forget how to walk." I thought he was just being philosophical. Michael eventually recovered, found steady work, and married Lauren when he was 32. Lauren was smart, organized, and very direct. She worked in healthcare administration and had a way of speaking that made people listen carefully. When Michael told us he planned to marry her, Arthur simply nodded. If she keeps him focused, Arthur said later, that might be exactly what he needs. For several years, everything seemed stable. Michael and Lauren moved to Columbus for work and bought a house in a growing suburb. Arthur and I visited a few times a year, usually during holidays. They had 2 children, Emily first, then Lucas. And becoming grandparents felt like discovering a new room in our hearts we didn't know existed. Life moved forward the way life does, quietly, steadily, until the night Arthur died. It was a Tuesday in early October. I remember the weather because Arthur had complained the entire afternoon about the cold wind outside. We were watching television when he suddenly pressed his hand to his chest and leaned forward. At first, I thought it was heartburn. By the time the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were already shaking their heads. The doctor at the hospital used gentle words, but the meaning was clear. Massive heart attack. Nothing they could do. After 42 years of marriage, the silence in that house felt unbearable. Grief is a strange companion. It changes the weight of every object around you. Arthur's chair felt too empty. His coffee mug felt like evidence of something stolen. For the first 3 months after his death, I barely left the house. Michael called often during that time. At first, his voice sounded genuinely worried. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone all the time," he told me one evening. "I'm all right." I insisted, though, that wasn't entirely true. But Michael kept calling, kept checking in. Lauren joined the calls sometimes, too. Then one Sunday afternoon, Michael drove up from Columbus and sat with me at the kitchen table where Arthur and I had eaten thousands of meals. "Mom," he said gently, "have you thought about moving closer to us?" I shook my head at first. "This is my home," I said. Michael nodded slowly. "I know, but it's also a lot to manage alone. The house, the yard, the bills. It's too much for one person your age." I remember the way he said "your age." Not cruelly, just practically. Lauren had already been researching options, he explained. Their house had a spare bedroom. The kids would love having their grandmother nearby. And I wouldn't have to deal with maintaining the old Cleveland house anymore. At the time, his reasoning sounded logical. Looking back now, I realized something important. Grief makes people very easy to persuade. Within 6 months, the Cleveland house was listed and sold. Michael helped handle most of the paperwork. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. The money from the sale was deposited into accounts Michael said he would help manage for me. I didn't question the details. At the time, just getting through each day felt like enough work. By the following spring, I packed the remaining pieces of my life into a moving truck and relocated to Columbus. Michael and Lauren welcomed me warmly that first week. The children hugged me every morning before school. Lauren showed me where everything was in the kitchen. Michael insisted I take the downstairs guest room so I wouldn't have to climb stairs. For a little while, it really did feel like a family. But families, I would soon learn, can change slowly. So slowly that you don't notice the shift until the ground beneath you has already moved. The first small signs appeared months later. And at the time, I told myself I was imagining them. At first, the changes were so small that I convinced myself they meant nothing. That's the dangerous thing about quiet disrespect. It grows in tiny pieces. A tone here, a look there, a sentence that could be interpreted 2 different ways if you tried hard enough. When I first moved into Michael and Lauren's house, they treated me like a guest. Lauren showed me where the coffee was kept and told me to help myself anytime. Michael insisted I relax and enjoy time with the grandchildren. Emily, who was 9 at the time, would come sit beside me in the evenings while she read her books, occasionally asking me to explain words she didn't understand. Those first few weeks almost felt comforting. Not the same as the life Arthur and I had built, of course, but still warm enough that the loneliness didn't crush me every day. But slowly, something began to shift. It started in the kitchen. Lauren liked things done a certain way. I respected that. It was her home, after all. But one afternoon, while I was making grilled cheese sandwiches for Emily and Lucas after school, Lauren walked in and watched me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Oh," she said lightly, "you don't need to cook. I usually handle meals. I just thought the kids might be hungry." I replied with a smile. She nodded, though her tone carried a hint of correction. "Next time, just ask me first. I like to keep track of what we're using." It didn't feel like an argument, just a small adjustment. But the adjustments kept coming. A few weeks later, I started doing laundry during the afternoons while the kids were at school. One evening, Lauren mentioned casually that electricity rates were higher during certain hours. "It might be better if you wait until evening," she said. "Of course," I answered quickly. I didn't realize. Again, it sounded practical, reasonable. But gradually, I noticed something else. Every time a household routine changed, the change seemed to move me slightly farther out of the center of the family's life. Lauren handled meals, Lauren managed groceries, Lauren decided when appliances should run. I began asking permission for things I once would have done automatically. Michael, meanwhile, became busier. He had always worked long hours, but now he seemed permanently distracted. Even when he was home, his attention stayed fixed on his phone or laptop. At dinner, he would listen to Lauren describe her day, while occasionally nodding, but our conversations became shorter. "How was your day, Mom?" he would ask politely. "Quiet," I would say. And that was usually the end of it. Still, I told myself I was lucky. I had a place to live. I had grandchildren who hugged me every morning. Many widows faced far worse, so I tried to be helpful. I began picking Emily up from school twice a week. I folded laundry in the evenings while watching television with Lucas. Sometimes I prepared small snacks for the children after homework. Emily loved those afternoons. She would sit at the kitchen table telling me stories about her classmates while I sliced apples or warmed soup. "You make things taste better than Mom," she whispered once conspiratorially. I laughed and told her not to say that too loudly, but even those small moments of joy began creating tension. One evening, Lauren walked into the kitchen just as Emily was finishing the soup I had made. Lauren's smile looked tight. "You didn't need to cook again," she said. "I just heated leftovers," I replied. Lauren nodded, but I noticed the way she glanced at the refrigerator afterward, as if calculating something. That was the first time I heard the word expenses. It happened a few weeks later. Michael and Lauren were talking in the living room late at night. I had gone upstairs to bed, but realized I had forgotten my phone downstairs. As I walked down the hallway, I heard Lauren's voice. "Groceries alone have gone up," she said quietly. Michael sighed. "I know. And utilities," she continued. 3 extra loads of laundry a week isn't nothing." I froze in the hallway. They were talking about me. Michael sounded uncomfortable. "She's my mom," he said. "I'm not saying she shouldn't be here," Lauren replied. "I'm saying we should acknowledge that it costs money." I stood there longer than I should have. Eventually, I went back upstairs without retrieving my phone. The next morning at breakfast, Lauren acted completely normal. Michael barely spoke at all, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time since moving into their home, I began to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Weeks passed. The comments became more frequent, though never openly cruel. Lauren once mentioned the grocery bill while glancing toward me. Another time, Michael joked that teenagers eat less than grandparents. Everyone laughed. Even I laughed. Because what else could I do? But underneath the humor, there was a quiet message forming. I was costing them something. The strange part was that I tried harder than ever to be useful. I vacuumed the living room when no one was home. I organized the children's backpacks before school. I folded towels, cleaned counters, and occasionally ran errands. Lauren thanked me politely, but the gratitude always sounded formal, like something you might say to a neighbor helping temporarily, not like something you would say to family. The only people who treated me exactly the same were the children. Lucas liked to show me his toy cars and explain complicated races he invented on the living room floor. Emily sometimes crawled into my room in the evenings just to talk. "You're my favorite person in this house," she told me once. I smiled at that, though her words carried a sadness she probably didn't intend, because by that time I had already begun noticing another pattern. My mail had stopped arriving. At first I assumed the postal service had made a mistake, then I realized something else. Michael had been collecting the mail before I could reach the box most days. When I asked casually whether anything had arrived for me, he always answered the same way. "Just junk mail, Mom." But one afternoon, while bringing in groceries, I noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter addressed clearly to me. It was from a bank I recognized. Michael picked it up quickly when he saw me looking. "I'll take care of this," he said. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the first time he had used that phrase, and suddenly I remembered something Arthur had once told me many years earlier. "Paperwork matters," he had said while organizing files in his office, "especially when people say they'll handle it for you." At the time, I had teased him for worrying too much. Now standing in my son's kitchen, watching him slide that envelope into a drawer, I felt the first quiet ripple of doubt. Not anger, not yet, just a question. And sometimes, a single unanswered question is where the truth begins. The first real crack in my trust didn't come from something Michael said. It came from something he didn't want me to see. After that afternoon in the kitchen when he quietly slipped the bank envelope into the drawer, I tried to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe it really was junk mail. Maybe he thought he was helping by organizing my paperwork. But once doubt enters your mind, it has a way of quietly rearranging the way you see everything. Over the next few weeks, I began paying closer attention. The mailbox, for example. Every day around 4 o'clock, the mail carrier drove down our street. I knew the sound of the truck now, the brief rumble of the engine slowing near the curb, the metallic clink of the mailbox door opening and closing. I started listening for that sound. The first few times I went outside to check the mail, I found the box already empty. Michael had beaten me to it. At first, I laughed it off, but then it kept happening. 3 days in a row, 4, 5, and every evening when I asked casually if anything had arrived for me, Michael gave the same answer. "Nothing important, Mom." The words sounded harmless enough, but his tone always carried a certain finality, as though the subject was closed before it had even begun. One afternoon, I decided to test something. The mail truck arrived while Michael was still at work, and Lauren was picking up the kids from soccer practice. For the first time in weeks, I reached the mailbox before anyone else. Inside were 3 envelopes. One was an advertisement for a furniture store. The second was a credit card offer addressed to Lauren. The third made my heart beat a little faster. It was from First National Bank of Cleveland, the same bank Arthur and I had used for most of our marriage. I stood there on the driveway, staring at my name printed neatly across the front, Joan Wright. The envelope felt heavier than a typical advertisement. Important. Carefully, I opened it. Inside was a statement. I didn't understand everything in the document at first. The numbers and account details meant little without context, but one line caught my attention immediately. Transfer authorization pending, and underneath it, a figure that made my breath catch. It wasn't a small amount of money, not even close. For a moment, I simply stood there in the afternoon sunlight trying to remember the last time I had personally authorized any transfer involving my accounts. I couldn't. Arthur had always managed most of our finances while he was alive, but after he passed, Michael had offered to help organize things. "You shouldn't have to deal with paperwork right now," he had told me gently. At the time, that kindness had felt like relief. Now looking down at the bank statement, it felt different. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my sweater pocket, just as Lauren's car pulled into the driveway. "Hey, Joan," she called cheerfully as she stepped out with the kids. "Anything interesting in the mail?" I hesitated for half a second. "Just advertisements," I said. That was the first lie I'd ever told inside my son's house, and it tasted strange in my mouth. That evening at dinner, I watched Michael a little more closely than usual. He looked tired, scrolling through something on his phone between bites of food. Lauren talked about a new administrative policy at the hospital where she worked. The children argued over who had cheated during a board game earlier that afternoon. It all looked perfectly normal, which somehow made the envelope in my pocket feel heavier. After dinner, while Lauren helped the kids with homework, I approached Michael in the living room. "Michael," I said gently, "have you been handling the accounts from the Cleveland house?" He looked up from his phone. "Yeah," he said. "Why, I was just wondering if everything was settled from the sale." Michael leaned back on the couch, clearly not expecting the question. "Of course it is," he said. "Why wouldn't it be?" I tried to keep my tone light. I just realized I haven't looked at any statements myself in a while. Michael's expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. "You don't need to worry about that," he replied. "I've been managing it." "That's kind of you," I said. "But maybe I should review things myself sometime." He laughed softly. "Mom, there's nothing to review. It's all taken care of." Taken care of, the same phrase he had used when sliding that envelope into the drawer weeks earlier. Something about the repetition made my stomach tighten again. "I trust you," I said carefully. Michael nodded. "I know." But neither of us spoke for a moment after that. Later that night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat quietly in my room with the bank statement spread across the small desk by the window. Streetlights outside cast pale orange shadows across the paper. I studied the numbers again. The pending transfer wasn't scheduled to complete for another 2 weeks, which meant something important. There was still time, but I needed more information. Arthur's voice echoed faintly in my memory. Paperwork matters. Arthur had always been meticulous about financial records. He kept copies of everything in a locked file cabinet in his office back in Cleveland. When we sold the house, Michael had helped pack most of those files. I realized suddenly that I didn't know where they had gone. Had they been stored somewhere, thrown away, or reviewed by someone who understood their value better than I did? My heart began beating faster as another thought formed. There was one person who might know. Arthur's attorney, Charles Whitaker. Arthur had worked with Whitaker for years, though I had rarely interacted with him directly. Legal meetings had always been Arthur's territory. But I remembered something Arthur had said not long before he died. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset when he mentioned Whitaker unexpectedly. If anything ever feels unclear after I'm gone, he told me, call Charles. At the time, I had laughed and told him he was being dramatic. Arthur had just smiled. Humor me, he said. Now sitting alone in my son's house with a bank statement that made no sense, I realized I might finally understand why Arthur had insisted on that promise. The next morning, while Lauren was taking the kids to school and Michael had already left for work, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. My hands trembled slightly as I searched for Whitaker's office. The number appeared on the screen within seconds. I stared at it for a long moment. Calling that number felt like stepping across an invisible line, because once I asked questions, the answers might change everything I believed about my son. Finally, I picked up the phone. The receptionist answered on the second ring. Whitaker and Associates, she said professionally. Hello, I replied quietly. My name is Joan Wright. There was a brief pause as she typed something. Yes, Mrs. Wright, I believe your firm worked with my late husband, Arthur Wright. Another pause. Then her tone softened slightly. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Whitaker handled several matters for Mr. Wright. How can we help you? I took a slow breath. I think I said carefully, I may need to speak with him. The receptionist placed me on hold for less than a minute, though it felt longer. I sat at the kitchen table staring out the window at the quiet suburban street, while soft instrumental music played through the phone. A neighbor across the road was walking his dog. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the mailbox. Everything looked ordinary. Yet inside my chest, something felt unsettled. Finally, a calm male voice came on the line. Mrs. Wright. Yes, I said quickly. This is Joan Wright, Charles Whitaker speaking. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say next. I had rehearsed the call in my head, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavier than expected. Mr. Whitaker. I'm sorry to call without notice. You never need to apologize for that. He replied warmly. Arthur always said you preferred quiet mornings. I assume something important came up? Hearing my husband's name spoken so casually brought a tightness to my throat. Yes, I said softly. Something has come up. There was a pause. Would you like to come into the office? Whitaker asked. Some matters are easier to discuss in person. I hesitated. The idea of driving across the city for a meeting that Michael didn't know about made me uneasy, but something inside me said this conversation needed to happen away from the house. I think that would be best, I replied. Whitaker gave me the address and suggested a time that afternoon. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for several minutes without moving. Part of me felt foolish. Maybe I had misunderstood the bank statement. Maybe everything really was taken care of just like Michael said. But another part of me remembered Arthur's careful voice, reminding me to ask questions when something didn't feel right. By early afternoon, I was sitting inside my car outside Whitaker and Associates, a modest brick office building tucked between a dental clinic and a real estate agency. The place looked exactly the way I imagined a small-town law firm should look: quiet, orderly, and slightly old-fashioned. Inside, the receptionist greeted me kindly and asked me to wait for a moment. A few minutes later, a tall man with silver hair stepped out of the hallway. Mrs. Wright, he said, extending his hand. Charles Whitaker looked almost exactly as I remembered him from Arthur's occasional descriptions, calm, thoughtful, and precise in the way he carried himself. Thank you for seeing me, I said. Of course, he replied. Arthur trusted me to help if you ever needed it. That sentence alone made my heart ache. Whitaker led me into a small office lined with shelves of neatly arranged files. A framed photograph of Arthur stood on one corner of the desk, an image taken years ago at what looked like a charity golf event. I hadn't seen that photo in years. Whitaker noticed my gaze. Arthur gave that to me after a fundraising tournament, he said with a small smile. He insisted it would remind me not to take myself too seriously. I laughed quietly. That sounds like him. We both sat down. Whitaker folded his hands calmly on the desk. Now he said, gently, "Tell me what's worrying you." I I took the bank statement from my purse and slid it across the desk. "This arrived yesterday," I explained. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and studied the document carefully. The room remained silent for nearly a full minute while he read. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I see," he said quietly. "Do you understand what it means?" I asked. Whitaker nodded slowly. "Yes." "I believe I do." My stomach tightened. And Whitaker chose his next words carefully. "This document indicates a pending transfer from an account connected to the Wright Family Trust." I blinked. "The what, the Wright Family Trust?" he repeated calmly. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't know what that is." Whitaker looked mildly surprised. "Arthur never discussed it with you." I shook my head. "Not in detail." Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "Your husband established the Wright Family Trust several years before his passing. It was designed to protect certain family assets and ensure financial stability for you." Protect, the word sounded unfamiliar in this context. "But Michael said he was managing my accounts," I said slowly. Whitaker nodded. "He likely has access to certain accounts connected to the trust, yes. Arthur allowed that under specific conditions." Conditions. Whitaker opened a drawer and removed a thick folder. Arthur believed strongly in planning ahead, he explained while flipping through pages, especially when it came to family finances. I felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion. "That sounds like him," I said. Whitaker found the document he was looking for and placed it on the desk between us. "This," he said, "is the original trust agreement." I glanced at the paperwork, though most of the legal language meant little to me. "What exactly does it do?" I asked. Whitaker explained patiently. Years earlier, when Arthur began preparing for retirement, he had placed a significant portion of our assets into a family trust. The purpose was simple: protect our savings, simplify inheritance planning, and ensure that I would always have financial independence even after he was gone. Arthur worried about many things, Whitaker said with a faint smile. But his biggest concern was that you would never feel dependent on anyone. Dependent. The word echoed in my mind. "So Michael isn't the owner of those assets?" I asked carefully. Whitaker shook his head. "No, not entirely." My heartbeat quickened. "Then why would a transfer be pending?" Whitaker studied the bank statement again. That, he said slowly, is the question we need to answer. I felt a sudden wave of nervousness. "Are you saying something is wrong?" Whitaker chose his words carefully. "I'm saying we should review recent activity connected to the trust, particularly if transactions were initiated without your knowledge." Without my knowledge, Whitaker met my eyes. "Mrs. Wright, you are the primary beneficiary of the Wright Family Trust." The words hung in the air between us. "Which means," he continued, "any major financial decisions involving those funds should involve your approval." My mind began racing. "But Michael has been handling everything," I said. Whitaker nodded. "And that arrangement may have been convenient. But convenience and authorization are not the same thing." For a moment the room felt very quiet. I thought about the envelope Michael had hidden in the drawer, about the phrase he kept repeating, "It's taken care of." I swallowed slowly. "What do we do now?" Whitaker closed the folder gently. "First," he said calmly, "we gather information." He slid the bank statement back toward me. "And second," he added, "we make sure no one is making decisions with your future that you didn't agree to." For the first time since Arthur died, I felt something unexpected stirring inside me. Not fear, not sadness, something closer to clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to realize, could change everything. Clarity is a strange feeling when it arrives after months of quiet doubt. For so long I had been telling myself that everything inside Michael's house was normal, that the uncomfortable moments were simply misunderstandings, that the unease I felt about the missing mail, the vague answers, and the financial questions was just the natural confusion of a widow learning to live in someone else's home. But sitting across from Charles Whitaker that afternoon, hearing the words "primary beneficiary," something inside me shifted. It was as if a fog had begun to lift. Whitaker opened the trust file again and turned several pages toward me. "Arthur was extremely precise about this structure," he said. "He wanted to make sure you always retained control." I studied the document, though the legal language was dense. Still, certain words stood out clearly: trustee, beneficiary, authorization. Whitaker pointed to a section midway through the document. This clause states that certain financial actions require your approval, he explained. Large transfers, asset reallocations, or structural changes to the trust accounts. My chest tightened slightly, and the transfer on the statement I asked. Whitaker folded his hands. That appears to be a request to move a substantial portion of funds into a new account structure. New account structure, I repeated. Yes. Is that normal? It can be, he said calmly, if all parties involved understand the change. I knew immediately what his careful wording meant, and if they don't, I asked. Whitaker looked at me directly. Then we need to find out who initiated it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the office window, traffic moved quietly through the afternoon streets of Columbus. People walked along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups or talking on their phones. Life outside the room continued as if nothing important was happening. But inside that office, my understanding of the past year was slowly rearranging itself. Michael told me he was managing my finances, I said quietly. Whitaker nodded. That may be partly true, but not entirely. No. I took a slow breath. Arthur trusted Michael, I said. Whitaker gave a small, thoughtful nod. Yes, he did, but he still created the trust. Whitaker leaned back in his chair slightly. Arthur believed trust and protection could exist at the same time, he said. That sounded exactly like my husband. Arthur had always believed that loving someone didn't mean ignoring the possibility of mistakes. Do you think Michael knows about the authorization requirement, I asked? Whitaker paused before answering. He likely knows the trust exists, he said, but the details of its protections may not have been fully discussed with him. Something about that statement unsettled me. If he doesn't know, I said slowly, then why would he attempt a transfer that requires my approval? Whitaker didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder inside the trust file and removed several printed statements. These are recent transaction summaries, he explained. He slid them across the desk. The numbers meant little to me at first, but Whitaker pointed to several entries. Over the past 6 months, he said that there have been multiple small withdrawals connected to trust-linked accounts. How small, 5,000 here, 8,000 there. Nothing enormous individually. But together, Whitaker tapped the page. Together, they add up. I felt a cold ripple move through my chest. Was I supposed to approve those? Whitaker shook his head. No. Those amounts fall within discretionary limits assigned to the secondary trustee. Secondary trustee Whitaker looked at me calmly. Michael. The word landed heavily. So Michael has been withdrawing money, yes, and that's allowed to a certain extent. I exhaled slowly. At least that part wasn't illegal, but something still didn't feel right. What about the transfer? I asked again. Whitaker tapped the bank statement. That amount exceeds his discretionary authority. How much does it exceed? Whitaker told me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The number was large enough that Arthur and I had once discussed it in the context of retirement security. Why would Michael try to move that much money? I asked quietly. Whitaker's expression remained professional. That's what we need to determine. I stared at the paper again. Michael had always been ambitious, but ambition had never meant dishonesty. Not when he was younger. Then again, Arthur's warning returned to my mind. Helping someone stand up is good, but carrying them too long can change them. Whitaker closed the file carefully. For now, he said the transfer is only pending. What does that mean exactly? It means the funds have not yet moved, so it can be stopped. Yes, the relief that washed through me surprised me, but the relief lasted only a moment. Michael will know if we stop it, I said. Whitaker nodded. That's correct. And if we don't, Whitaker looked thoughtful. If the authorization request reaches your signature without explanation, the transfer would require your approval to proceed. I frowned, but I never received anything asking for approval. Whitaker tapped the statement again. That suggests someone may be attempting to process the request through channels assuming your consent. My stomach tightened. You mean, assuming I wouldn't notice? Whitaker didn't answer that directly. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Mrs. Wright, have you personally reviewed any trust-related documents in the past year? I shook my head slowly. No. Have you signed anything recently related to finances? I thought carefully. The answer came back immediately. No. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. Then the safest approach right now is observation. Observation. Yes. He opened a small notebook and wrote something down. We don't alert anyone yet. We simply monitor the situation. And if Michael asks about the transfer, Whitaker met my eyes. Then we will know the request came from him. For a moment, the room felt unusually quiet again. I thought about the dinner table the night before, about the calm way Michael had told me I ate for free. If he had been moving money from the trust, the irony felt almost unbearable. Whitaker closed his notebook. There's one more thing, he said. Yes. Arthur added a clause near the end of the trust. He flipped to the last section of the document. This clause activates if the primary beneficiary, meaning you, believes the trust is being misused. I leaned forward slightly. What does it do? Whitaker smiled faintly. It gives you the authority to take full administrative control of the trust immediately. I blinked. You mean... Over Michael Whitaker nodded. Yes, the idea felt almost surreal. For months I had been living in my son's home, feeling like a dependent guest. Yet legally, the financial foundation beneath that house might still be connected to decisions Arthur and I had made long before. Whitaker closed the folder again. For now, he said gently, you don't need to do anything drastic. What should I do then? He answered calmly, pay attention. I nodded slowly, because suddenly, for the first time in a long while, I realized something important. I wasn't powerless. I'd simply been unaware, and awareness, once it arrives, is very difficult to ignore. When I left Charles Whitaker's office that afternoon, the sky above Columbus had turned a pale gray, the kind of quiet overcast that makes the world feel slightly muted. Cars moved along the street in a steady stream. People hurried past, carrying briefcases or grocery bags, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked behind a fence. Life looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but I didn't feel the same. For months, perhaps longer, I had been living inside a story someone else was quietly writing for me. A story where I was the aging widow who needed help managing her affairs. The mother who should be grateful for a spare bedroom and warm meals. The woman who had slowly become an expense inside her son's household. But now, sitting behind the wheel of my car with the trust documents fresh in my mind, that story no longer felt complete. Arthur had built something I didn't fully understand, and Michael might be trying to change it. The drive back to the house took nearly 40 minutes. During that time, I replayed the conversation with Whitaker again and again in my head. The trust, the discretionary withdrawals, the pending transfer, the clause that allowed me to take full control. Arthur had never told me the details, but suddenly his caution made sense. He hadn't doubted Michael. He had simply understood something about human nature. Money changes pressure. Pressure changes behavior. When I pulled into the driveway, Lauren's car was already there. The children's bicycles lay scattered across the lawn the way they often did after school. For a moment, I sat inside the car watching the front of the house. It looked perfectly peaceful. White siding, flower beds Lauren maintained carefully every spring, the large oak tree in the yard where Lucas liked to hang his soccer net. This was Michael's house. At least that's how it had always been described. But Whitaker's documents had complicated that picture. A portion of the financial support that stabilized Michael's life after his failed business, the money Arthur and I had quietly arranged years earlier, had been tied to the trust. And the trust, legally speaking, still revolved around me. I stepped out of the car and walked inside. Lauren stood at the kitchen counter cutting vegetables while Emily sat nearby doing homework. "Hi, Joan," Lauren said without looking up. "You were out for a while. I ran a few errands," I replied. Emily smiled when she saw me. "Grandma, look," she said, holding up a worksheet. "I got every spelling word right." "That's wonderful," I told her, leaning down to look at the page. "I knew you would." Lauren glanced over briefly. "She's been working hard," she said. "Michael should be home soon." The normal rhythm of the house continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Dinner preparations, homework, the quiet hum of a dishwasher in the background. Yet I noticed something new now, that Whitaker had sharpened my attention. Lauren moved through the kitchen with a sense of ownership that made perfect sense. After all, it was her home. But there was also a subtle way she controlled every aspect of the space. Which cabinet was used, which ingredients were allowed, even the order in which things were cleaned. I had accepted those routines without question for months. Now I wondered if that quiet control extended beyond the kitchen. Later that evening, Michael arrived home. He looked tired, loosening his tie as he stepped through the front door. "Hey, Mom," he said automatically. "Hello, Michael." He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen island while Lauren finished cooking. For a few minutes, the conversation remained light. Lucas talked about a soccer game at school. Emily described a science project involving plants. Then Lauren brought up something practical. "Mortgage rates might go up again," she said to Michael. Michael frowned slightly. "Great," he muttered. "They're predicting adjustments this fall." Michael rubbed his forehead. "Everything costs more lately." Lauren nodded. "Utilities, too." I watched quietly from the table. For the first time since moving into the house, I began noticing how often their conversations circled back to money. Mortgage, bills, groceries, school expenses. Michael leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes it feels like we're just barely keeping everything balanced," he said. Lauren gave him a sympathetic look. "I know." I said nothing, but Whitaker's words echoed in my mind. Discretionary withdrawals, pending transfer. The next morning, I decided to follow Whitaker's advice. Pay attention. I started small. Instead of assuming Michael handled the mail, I checked the mailbox earlier in the day. That morning, there were 2 envelopes addressed to me, both from financial institutions. When Michael came home that evening, he noticed them on the table. "You got mail today?" he asked casually. "Yes." "What was it, just statements?" Michael nodded, but I noticed the quick glance he exchanged with Lauren. It lasted less than a second. But now that I was watching closely, I saw it. That brief moment of silent communication, the kind people use when they believe someone else isn't paying attention. Over the next few days, I observed more things. Michael spent a surprising amount of time reviewing documents on his laptop late at night. Sometimes he would close the screen quickly when I walked into the room. Lauren occasionally asked him questions in a low voice. "Did you send it?" "Not yet. Make sure it's done before the deadline." Once while passing the living room, I heard Michael say something that made me stop in the hallway. "It'll go through soon," he said quietly. Lauren replied with a short laugh. "Then everything will finally be simpler." Simpler. The word lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. That night, sitting alone in my room, I opened the folder Whitaker had given me. Inside were copies of the trust summary and several notes explaining how the system worked. One paragraph caught my attention. Secondary trustees may request adjustments to asset allocation, but transfers exceeding discretionary limits require approval from the primary beneficiary. Primary beneficiary, me. For months I had been living as if I had no authority over my own financial future. Meanwhile, Michael might be making plans based on the assumption that I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I wouldn't understand. I closed the folder slowly. Arthur had once told me that people rarely show their true intentions when everything is easy. Those intentions appear when something valuable is at stake. Perhaps that moment had finally arrived, and if it had, then the quiet house where my son believed I ate for free might soon become the place where the truth finally stepped into the light. Once you begin paying attention, you start seeing things that were always there. They simply no longer hide behind routine. For the next several days, I followed Charles Whitaker's advice carefully. I didn't confront Michael. I didn't ask questions that might alert him. Instead, I watched. I listened. And slowly, pieces of a picture I hadn't known existed began fitting together. The first clue came on a Thursday evening. Lauren was in the living room scrolling through something on her tablet, while Michael sat beside her with a stack of papers. I was passing through the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard my name. "She won't question it," Lauren said quietly. Michael sighed. "I know, but the timing has to be right." My footsteps slowed automatically. "What if Whitaker contacts her?" Lauren asked. Michael shook his head. "He won't. Everything's structured through the account management system now." Lauren leaned back. "Well, as long as it goes through," before her voice dropped too low for me to hear the rest. I moved away from the hallway before they could notice I had paused. My heart was beating faster than usual. Whitaker. They had mentioned his name. That meant Michael knew exactly who controlled the trust. Yet he had still attempted the transfer. That realization stayed with me through dinner that night. Michael behaved normally. Lauren asked Emily about her upcoming school play. Lucas argued about finishing his vegetables, but the conversation in the living room echoed inside my mind. She won't question it. For months, that assumption had been correct. I hadn't questioned anything. But things had changed. The next clue arrived the following afternoon. Emily came home from school earlier than usual because of a teacher conference day. While Lauren was still at work and Michael hadn't returned yet, Emily wandered into the kitchen where I was preparing tea. "Grandma," she said casually, "Dad's been really stressed lately." "Oh," I asked. "He and Mom talk about money a lot." I nodded. "That happens in many families." Emily shrugged. "But yesterday I heard Mom say something weird." "What was that?" She said once, "Everything transfers. We won't have to worry anymore." My hands paused over the teacup. "Transfers?" I asked gently. Emily nodded. "Yeah, I think she meant bank stuff. Children rarely realize when they reveal something important. They simply repeat what they hear." "What were they talking about exactly?" I asked. Emily frowned slightly. "I don't know. But Mom said something about timing. Timing, the same word Michael had used." Later that evening, I walked past the home office Michael used for work. The door was slightly open. Inside, Michael sat at his desk reviewing documents on his laptop. Several printed pages lay spread across the desk beside him. Normally, I would have continued walking, but tonight I paused. Michael didn't notice me standing in the hallway. His attention remained fixed on the screen while he typed something carefully. Then he reached for one of the printed documents. For a brief moment, I could see the heading, Account Transfer Authorization. The words were unmistakable. My pulse quickened. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying the page. Then he muttered something under his breath. "Just needs the final approval." Final approval. Whitaker's explanation returned to my mind immediately. Any transfer of that size required authorization from the primary beneficiary, which meant me. Yet no one had asked for my approval. The next morning, I called Whitaker again. He answered personally this time. "Mrs. Wright, Charles." I said quietly, "I think Michael is expecting a transfer to go through soon." Whitaker's tone sharpened slightly. "What makes you say that I explained everything I had overheard during the past few days? Lauren mentioning timing, Emily repeating the word transfer, Michael reviewing documents labeled authorization. Whitaker listened without interrupting. When I finished, he spoke carefully. That confirms something I suspected. What the transfer request likely originated from Michael. My chest tightened. Can he complete it without me? No, Whitaker said firmly. Then why would he act like it's already decided? Whitaker paused. Because he may believe you'll sign the authorization when it arrives. I frowned, but it never arrived. Whitaker's voice became thoughtful. That suggests the authorization request hasn't reached the final stage yet, meaning the financial institution is still processing the request internally, and when it's ready, then they'll require your signature. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing that information. Michael might believe everything was already arranged, but in reality, the process still depended on me. Whitaker continued speaking. Mrs. Wright, the situation may explain something else. Why Michael hasn't pressured you directly? What do you mean? If he believes you're unaware of the trust structure, he might expect you to sign anything he places in front of you. A cold realization passed through me. For months, Michael had been managing paperwork, organizing documents, and occasionally asking me to sign forms related to taxes or insurance. I had rarely read them closely, because I trusted him. Whitaker spoke again. When the authorization arrives, Michael will likely present it as routine paperwork and expect me to sign it. Yes. Silence filled the phone line for a moment. What should I do? I asked. Whitaker answered calmly. Wait, yes. Let the authorization request reach its final stage, and then we'll decide how to respond. After the call ended, I sat quietly in the kitchen thinking about everything Whitaker had said. Michael believed I was unaware. Lauren believed I wouldn't question anything. They were planning something that depended entirely on my silence. And until now, silence had been exactly what I gave them. That evening, Michael came home later than usual. He walked into the kitchen looking unusually confident. Lauren noticed it too. You seem in a better mood, she said. Michael smiled slightly. Things are starting to fall into place. Lauren raised an eyebrow. Already soon, Michael replied. Soon. I watched them from across the table, my expression calm. Inside, my thoughts were very different. Because for the first time since Arthur died, I realized something clearly. Michael believed the future of our family finances was already settled. He believed the transfer would go through. He believed the house, the accounts, and the structure Arthur built would soon be rearranged. But he didn't know one critical detail. The final decision wasn't his. It never had been. And when that moment arrived, I would finally decide what happened next. The strange thing about waiting for the truth is that time begins to feel heavier. Every day that passed after my conversation with Charles Whitaker felt like a quiet countdown. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. The house remained calm. Dinner was cooked, dishes were washed, and the children continued their routines of school and homework. Yet underneath that ordinary rhythm, something was clearly moving toward a moment neither Michael nor Lauren realized I was already preparing for. Whitaker had told me to observe, so I did. And once I truly began watching, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Michael spent more and more time in the home office in the evenings. The door remained closed most nights now. Occasionally, Lauren would step inside for a few minutes and their voices would drop into the low tone people use when discussing things they believe should not be overheard. The word transfer appeared more often. So did another word, deadline. One evening, while walking past the office on my way upstairs, I heard Lauren whisper something that made me pause. "Did they confirm the processing window?" Michael answered in a tired voice. "They said once the authorization is submitted, it should finalize within 10 days. Lauren exhaled. "Good. We need that to happen before the end of the month. End of the month." I continued up the stairs without letting them know I had heard. By now, I understood the strategy. Michael wasn't planning to secretly move the money without my involvement. He was planning something quieter. He was waiting for the authorization request to reach the final stage, then presenting it to me as routine paperwork. If I signed it as he clearly expected, the transfer would become official. Arthur's trust would shift. And the financial foundation Michael had quietly built his future plans on would finally be under his full control. The realization didn't make me angry at first. It made me sad, because this wasn't the boy Arthur and I had raised, at least not the boy we believed we raised. The next morning, I drove to the grocery store early, partly because we needed milk and bread, but mostly because I needed time to think away from the house. While walking through the produce aisle, I suddenly remembered something Arthur had said years earlier. It was shortly after Michael's failed business venture. Arthur and I had been discussing how much financial help we should offer. "He's our son," I had said firmly. Arthur agreed, but he had also added something that stayed with me now. "Helping someone is good," he said. "But if the help becomes invisible to them, they may begin to believe they built everything alone." At the time, I thought Arthur was being overly cautious. Now I wondered if he had simply been realistic. When I returned home later that afternoon, I found something waiting for me on the kitchen table, an envelope. It was thicker than normal mail, and the return address was unmistakable. First National Bank of Cleveland. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at it. The authorization request had arrived. My pulse slowed strangely instead of quickening, because now the waiting was over. I picked up the envelope and carried it quietly into my room. Closing the door behind me, I sat at the small desk by the window and opened it carefully. Inside were several documents. The heading on the first page confirmed everything: Trust Asset Reallocation Authorization. Below that title was a description of the requested transfer amount, the same number I had seen on the earlier bank statement. The amount was large enough that it represented a major restructuring of the trust. And at the bottom of the document was the section Whitaker had warned me about. Primary beneficiary signature required. My name was printed clearly beneath the signature line. For several minutes, I simply studied the pages. Michael had already completed most of the paperwork. His name appeared in the section identifying the requesting trustee. The bank had prepared the document for my authorization. All that remained was my signature. I could almost picture how Michael expected this moment to unfold. He would come home from work, mention casually that some financial documents needed to be signed, and place the papers in front of me at the kitchen table. I would skim them briefly, trusting him the way I always had. Then I would sign. Everything would be finished. Except Michael didn't know one thing. I had already spoken to Charles Whitaker, and Whitaker had explained exactly what this document meant. That evening, Michael arrived home looking slightly nervous. Lauren greeted him quietly near the doorway. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, but I saw the quick glance they both directed toward the kitchen table. They had noticed the envelope. Michael walked into the kitchen where I was slicing apples for Emily. "Mom," he said casually, "did you check the mail today?" "Yes." He hesitated for a half a second. "Anything interesting?" I wiped my hands on a towel and looked at him calmly. There was something from the bank. Michael nodded slowly. "Oh, good." Lauren stepped into the kitchen behind him. "That must be the account update," she said lightly. Michael forced a small smile. "Yeah, just some paperwork." I waited. Neither of them mentioned the trust directly. Instead, Michael reached for the envelope on the table and opened it as though he hadn't already expected its contents. He pulled out the documents and flipped through them quickly. "Nothing complicated," he said. Then he slid the papers toward me. "Just need your signature here." For a moment the room felt completely still. Lauren leaned casually against the counter. Emily continued doing homework at the table, unaware of the tension building around her. I looked down at the document. The signature line waited patiently at the bottom of the page. Michael watched me carefully. He was trying to look relaxed, but I could see the tightness in his shoulders. Lauren spoke in a gentle tone. "It's just routine banking stuff." Routine. The word almost made me smile, because now I understood something they didn't. This wasn't routine. This was the moment everything Arthur had built was being tested. I picked up the pen slowly. Michael's eyes followed the movement. Lauren's expression softened with relief. They were both certain of what would happen next. But as I held the pen above the signature line, I heard Arthur's voice in my memory again. "Paperwork matters." I set the pen down carefully. Then I looked up at my son. "Michael," I said calmly, "before I sign anything." His smile froze slightly. "I think we should talk." And in that quiet kitchen, I saw something in Michael's eyes for the first time. Not confidence, not control, but uncertainty, because suddenly the outcome he had been expecting no longer seemed guaranteed. The moment I said those words, "I think we should talk," the air in the kitchen changed. It wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. Emily continued writing spelling words at the table, completely unaware of the tension that had quietly settled between the adults in the room. But Michael noticed immediately. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened. "What do you mean?" he asked. His tone was still polite, but it carried something else now, a hint of caution. Lauren straightened slightly where she leaned against the counter. "It's just routine paperwork," she said again with a small laugh. "Banks send those all the time." I nodded slowly, keeping my voice calm. "I'm sure they do." Then I gently slid the document back across the table. "But this one seems a little more important than routine." Michael's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Why would you think that?" he asked. I turned the page around so he could see the heading. "Because this says Trust Asset Reallocation Authorization." For a moment no one spoke. Emily looked up briefly, sensing something in the adults' voices, then returned to her homework. Michael cleared his throat. "Yeah," he said. "That's just moving some funds around. Moving them where I asked." His eyes flickered briefly toward Lauren. "It's just restructuring accounts," he replied. "Nothing complicated." I folded my hands on the table. "That's interesting." Michael frowned slightly. "What is? Because I spoke with Charles Whitaker yesterday." The silence that followed felt like the sudden drop of a heavy curtain. Lauren's face went pale. Michael's expression froze completely. For the first time since Arthur died, I saw my son truly unsure of himself. "You talked to Whitaker," Michael said slowly. "Yes." His eyes narrowed slightly. Why I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked down at the document again. "He explained the trust structure Arthur created," I said calmly. Michael leaned back in his chair. "I already told you about the trust," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "You told me you were managing my accounts." Lauren stepped forward now. "Joan, I think you might be misunderstanding something." I held up a gentle hand. "Lauren, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. Yet." The word remained unspoken. Michael ran a hand through his hair. "Mom, there's nothing suspicious here." I nodded. That may be true. He leaned forward again, pushing the document toward me once more. Then just sign it. His tone had changed. It was still calm, but now there was pressure behind it. I noticed the way Lauren watched me closely from across the kitchen, waiting, hoping, expecting. For months they had believed I was the quiet widow who didn't understand the paperwork, the woman who would sign whatever her son placed in front of her. But Arthur had known better. And now, finally, so did I. "I have a question first," I said. Michael sighed impatiently. "Mom, how much money is this transfer moving?" His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not important. It is to me." Michael hesitated. Then he said the number. Even though I already knew it, hearing him say it aloud changed something in the room. Lauren quickly spoke. "It's just reallocating funds so everything is easier to manage. Easier for who I asked, gently." Michael's patience began to crack. "For all of us." I tilted my head slightly. "That's interesting." He frowned. "Why? Because Charles explained something very clearly." Michael's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "What did he say?" "He said any transfer of that size requires my approval." Michael nodded. "Exactly. But he also said something else." Michael didn't respond. He said the primary beneficiary of the trust is me. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. Michael's voice became sharper. "Mom, of course it's you." Then why, I asked quietly, was this transfer requested without my knowledge? Lauren opened her mouth. Michael spoke first. "It wasn't without your knowledge." I gestured toward the document. "I'm seeing it for the first time right now. That's because the bank only finalized the paperwork today." After the request was submitted, I replied. Michael didn't answer. The room remained still for several seconds. Then Lauren stepped forward again. "Joan," she said in a softer voice, "Michael has been handling the finances because you've been going through a lot this year." Her tone was sympathetic, almost comforting, but the words carried a subtle message. "You're vulnerable. You need help." For months that message had shaped my place in this house. Now I looked at her calmly. "I appreciate the help," I said. Lauren smiled slightly. "Exactly. But help," I continued, "usually involves explaining what's happening." Michael leaned forward again. "Mom, you're making this into something it's not." "Am I?" "Yes." He tapped the document. "This is about simplifying the trust so we can manage things better." "We?" I asked. Michael exhaled. "Yes, we." I studied his face carefully. For a moment I saw something there that reminded me of the boy he once was. Nervous, hopeful, trying to justify something he already knew was wrong. But then that expression hardened. "Mom," he said firmly, "just sign it." Emily looked up from her homework again. Dad Michael forced a quick smile at her. "It's nothing, sweetheart." Then he looked back at me. And this time the patience in his voice had disappeared completely. "You live here," he said quietly. "We take care of everything for you." The words sounded familiar, almost identical to the sentence he had spoken the night before. "You eat for free here." For a moment, I simply watched him. Then I did something he clearly wasn't expecting. I smiled, not angrily, not bitterly, just calmly. "Michael," I said softly. "Yes, I'm not signing this tonight." Lauren's breath caught. Michael stared at me. "What I need time to review it." His voice sharpened. "There's nothing to review. There is for me." Lauren stepped closer. "Joan, delaying this could complicate things." "I'm sure it could." Michael stood up now. "This isn't necessary." I met his eyes. Neither was submitting the transfer request without telling me. The silence in the kitchen stretched long enough that even Emily sensed something serious was happening. Michael looked from me to the document and back again. For the first time since placing the papers in front of me, he no longer looked confident, because the simple outcome he expected, my signature, had just disappeared, and suddenly the future he had been planning for months was no longer certain. The silence in the kitchen after I said I wouldn't sign the document felt heavier than any argument. Michael remained standing at the table, staring at the unsigned papers as though they had suddenly become something dangerous. Lauren folded her arms slowly, her expression tightening. Emily and Lucas sensed the tension even though they didn't understand it. Lucas had stopped eating entirely, and Emily was watching her father with wide, uncertain eyes. Michael finally spoke. "Mom," he said carefully, "this isn't something that needs days of review." "I understand," I replied. He gestured toward the document again. "Then why delay it?" I looked down at the pages. The numbers were printed clearly, the transfer amount, the account references, the legal language Arthur had once trusted someone else to explain. "It's not a delay," I said calmly. "It's a decision." Michael's jaw tightened. Lauren stepped forward. "Joan, maybe we should talk about this privately," she suggested. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the children. I nodded. That might be a good idea. Michael turned to Emily and Lucas. "Why don't you two go upstairs for a bit," he said. "We need to talk about some adult things." Emily hesitated. "Is everything okay?" Michael forced a smile. "Of course." Reluctantly, the children gathered their things and walked upstairs. The moment their footsteps faded, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted again. Lauren's polite tone disappeared. "Joan," she said firmly, "we've been taking care of your finances for over a year, I know, and Michael has been making sure everything stays organized. I'm aware of that too. Then this hesitation doesn't make sense." I folded my hands quietly on the table. "It makes sense to me." Michael let out a frustrated breath. "Mom, this is exactly what I was trying to avoid." "What do you mean, confusion?" he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You think asking questions is confusion?" Lauren spoke before he could answer. "It's not about questions," she said. "It's about trust." The word hung in the air. Trust. I looked from Lauren to Michael. "That's an interesting word to bring up," I said softly. Michael frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means trust usually goes both ways." Michael rubbed his forehead. "Mom, we're trying to help you. By moving a large portion of the trust into a new structure, yes. Without telling me first, Michael's voice sharpened. It wasn't a secret. Then why didn't you mention it?" He hesitated. And that hesitation told me more than his answer would have. Lauren stepped forward again, trying to regain control of the conversation. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said. "Is it?" "Yes." She pointed to the document. "That money is being moved into an account that's easier to manage. For who?" I asked. "For the family." The word sounded strange in her voice. "Which family?" I asked quietly. Lauren blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means the Wright family trust was created by Arthur to protect certain assets." Michael crossed his arms. "We know that. Do you know who the primary beneficiary is?" Michael's eyes hardened slightly. "You." "Exactly." Lauren let out an impatient sigh. "We're not taking anything away from you. I didn't say you were." Michael leaned forward again. "Then what are you implying?" I met his gaze calmly. "I'm asking why the trust needs to be restructured at all." Michael hesitated again. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. "Because it's inefficient the way it is." I tilted my head slightly. Inefficient for who? Michael exhaled sharply. "For managing long-term financial planning. Long-term for who? For the family." The frustration in his voice filled the room. Lauren spoke more quietly. "Joan, we're thinking about the future." "So am I." Michael shook his head. "No, you're thinking about paperwork." I smiled slightly. "That's interesting." "Why? Because Arthur used to say paperwork was where the truth lived." Michael froze. For a brief moment, the memory of his father crossed his face. Then Lauren spoke again. "Arthur isn't here anymore," she said carefully. "No, I agreed. But the trust he created is—" Michael pushed the document toward me again. "Mom, this isn't complicated." I looked at the page. "Actually, it is." Michael's voice rose slightly. "No, it isn't. It is when a transfer that large changes the structure of the trust." Lauren shook her head. "It doesn't change anything. That's not what Whitaker said." Both of them went silent again. Michael stared at me. "You told Whitaker everything I told him enough." His voice turned cold. "So now you don't trust your own son?" I looked at him quietly. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether my son was honest with me." Michael slammed his hand lightly against the table. "I've been handling everything for you." "Yes," I said calmly. "Exactly. And that's why I'm asking questions." Lauren looked frustrated now. "This conversation is pointless." "Is it?" "Yes." She pointed to the document again. "If you don't sign this, the bank will start asking questions." I nodded slowly. "That's fine." Michael stared at me. "You're serious?" "Yes. Even if it complicates things, yes." Michael looked toward the staircase where the children had disappeared earlier, then back at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you understand what you're doing?" I held his gaze. "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "No, you don't." I leaned back in my chair. "Michael," I said gently, "I understand something you might not." "What? That the Wright family trust wasn't built to make things easy." He frowned. "What was it built for?" I answered calmly. It was built to protect the person Arthur believed might need protection someday. Michael's eyes narrowed. And who's that supposed to be? I folded the document closed and slid it back across the table. Right now, I said softly, I'm beginning to think it might be me. The room went completely quiet, because for the first time since Arthur died, my son was no longer speaking to a helpless widow. He was speaking to the person who controlled the future he had already planned. After those words left my mouth, the kitchen fell into a silence that felt almost physical. Michael didn't speak right away. Lauren didn't either. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator behind us. Michael finally laughed, but there was no humor in it. So that's what this is about, he said. I tilted my head slightly. What do you mean you think I'm trying to take something from you? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Lauren stepped closer to him. Michael, calm down, she said quietly. But Michael's frustration had already surfaced. For over a year, he said, I've been taking care of everything. I know. I've been handling the accounts, the paperwork, the taxes, everything. Yes. And now suddenly you think I'm doing something wrong? I kept my voice steady. I think you submitted a transfer request without explaining it to me. That's not the same thing, isn't it? Michael ran both hands through his hair. Mom, this trust was never meant to create problems. You're right, it was meant to support the family. Yes, so that's what I'm doing. His voice had grown louder now. Lauren placed a hand on his arm. Michael. He pulled away slightly, still looking at me. Arthur wanted this money to help his family. I nodded slowly. He did. And I'm his son. Yes. So why are you acting like I'm some kind of criminal? I sighed quietly. I'm not acting like anything. Michael gestured toward the document again. This transfer doesn't take anything away from you. Then why didn't you explain it before submitting the request? He didn't answer immediately. Lauren did. Because we knew you'd react like this, she said. I looked at her. Like what's suspicious? I let that word sit in the air for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since Whitaker showed me the trust file. How much of the trust has already been withdrawn? Michael froze. Lauren's expression tightened. That's not relevant, she said quickly. I think it is. Michael looked at Lauren briefly, then back at me. I've taken some discretionary withdrawals. How much? He hesitated, within the limits allowed. That wasn't my question. The tension in the room thickened. Michael's voice dropped. You're interrogating me now. No. Then what is this? It's a conversation. Lauren folded her arms. It doesn't feel like one. I leaned forward slightly. Let me ask you something, Lauren. She looked surprised. All right. When you and Michael talk about this transfer, what exactly do you believe it will accomplish? Lauren's answer came quickly. It will make the financial structure more efficient. That's what Michael said earlier. Because it's true. Efficient, how Lauren hesitated. Then she said something revealing. It consolidates the trust assets into an account we can manage long term. She didn't answer. Michael spoke instead. It's for the future. What future? Our family's future. I looked at him carefully. You mean Emily and Lucas? Yes, and you. Michael frowned. Well, yes, and Lauren, of course. I nodded slowly. And where do I fit into that future? Michael looked genuinely confused. You're living here with us. That wasn't my question. Lauren answered this time. You're part of the family. Then why, I asked quietly, did Michael say last night that I eat here for free? Neither of them spoke. The memory of that sentence hung between us like a shadow. Michael finally looked away. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He rubbed his face. I was frustrated. With what? Everything? Lauren stepped forward again. This conversation isn't helping anything. Maybe not, I said calmly. But it's revealing things. Michael looked back at me. Like what? Like the way you see me now. His expression hardened. That's not fair, isn't it? He slammed his hand lightly against the counter. I've been supporting you. I blinked. Supporting me? Yes. I leaned back in my chair. That's interesting. Michael's eyes flashed. What is? Because the trust that supports this family was built by Arthur. Michael stared at me. That doesn't change anything, doesn't it? No? Then why are we having this conversation? Michael opened his mouth but didn't speak. Lauren's voice cut in. This isn't about control. What is it about responsibility? I nodded thoughtfully. Responsibility is important. Yes, and the trust gives that responsibility to someone. Michael looked irritated. To you. Yes. Lauren sighed. And you're refusing to use it. I'm using it right now. Michael stared at me. By refusing to sign, by asking questions. Lauren shook her head. This is going nowhere. I stood slowly from the table. Actually, I said gently, it's going somewhere very important. Michael crossed his arms. Where toward the truth? He laughed bitterly. You think the truth is that I'm trying to steal from you? I think the truth is that you believed I wouldn't notice what you were doing. Michael's face flushed. That's ridiculous. Is it? Yes. I picked up the document again. Then explained something to me. Why does this transfer move the funds into an account structure where you become the managing authority? Michael froze. Lauren's eyes widened slightly, because now we had reached the detail Whitaker had pointed out, the detail Michael clearly hoped I would never notice. Michael recovered quickly. It's still part of the trust, but under your control. That's not the same thing. It feels similar. Michael looked at Lauren again. Lauren stepped forward, trying one more time to soften the conversation. Joan, this isn't about taking control. Then what is it about? Lauren hesitated. Michael answered. It's about making sure the future is secure. I looked at him quietly. And you believe that future doesn't require my approval. Michael's voice dropped. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I smiled gently. Michael. Yes. For the first time in a long while, I placed the unsigned document back on the table. I think things are finally becoming clear. Neither he nor Lauren responded, but the tension in the room had changed again, because now they understood something they hadn't expected. This conversation was no longer about convincing me to sign a piece of paper. It was about something far more uncomfortable, the truth about what they had been planning all along. After that conversation, something in the house shifted. It wasn't loud. There were no slammed doors or shouting matches echoing down the hallway. In fact, on the surface, everything remained strangely calm. But beneath that calm, the balance of the house had changed. For months, Michael and Lauren had believed they understood the situation completely. They believed they were managing everything. My finances, my living arrangements, even the quiet assumptions about my place in the family. Now they knew something different. They knew I had spoken with Charles Whitaker. And that knowledge made them careful. The next few days passed with an unusual politeness. Lauren spoke to me with extra patience, almost overly cheerful. Michael avoided long conversations whenever possible. When he did speak, his tone was controlled as though each word had been measured before leaving his mouth. It reminded me of the way people behave around fragile glass. They weren't sure what might break, but they knew something could. One evening, 3 days after the unsigned authorization sat untouched on the kitchen table, Michael knocked on my bedroom door. Mom, yes, can we talk? I looked up from the book I was reading. Of course. Michael stepped inside slowly and closed the door behind him. For a moment, he stood near the window without speaking. The hesitation in his posture reminded me of a much younger version of him, one who used to stand exactly that way when he had broken something in the house and wasn't sure how to tell me. Finally, he sat down in the chair across from me. I think things got out of hand the other night, he said. I waited. I didn't mean for the conversation to turn into an argument. It didn't, I said gently. Michael rubbed his hands together. You know I'm trying to help the family. I know you believe that. He frowned slightly. Believe yes. Michael leaned forward. Mom, this transfer wasn't about taking anything from you. I understand. It was about simplifying the trust structure so we can manage things long term. I remember you saying that. Michael's voice softened. I've been under a lot of pressure lately, with work, with everything. He gestured vaguely. Mortgage payments, school expenses, rising costs, all of it. I nodded slowly. Life was expensive now, in ways Arthur and I had rarely experienced. Michael continued. When Dad helped us after my business failed, it saved us. I listened carefully, but we've been trying to rebuild ever since, he said. And you have, I replied. He shook his head slightly. Not as much as you think. The admission surprised me. For the first time, Michael sounded less defensive, more tired. We're carrying a lot of debt, he said quietly. I didn't interrupt. the house, the kids' school, everything. Michael looked down at his hands. That transfer would have stabilized things, stabilized how it would have allowed us to restructure some financial obligations, meaning pay off debt, yes. I considered his words carefully. So the trust funds would become part of your financial structure. Michael nodded slowly. For the family. The phrase sounded familiar now, but something about the way he said it this time felt slightly different. Less confident, Michael, I said quietly. Yes, why didn't you tell me that earlier? He hesitated. Then he gave the most honest answer I had heard from him since this situation began. Because I knew you might say no. The room became very quiet. Michael continued speaking. I thought if you saw the paperwork in front of you, you'd realize it made sense. Without asking questions, he didn't respond. After a moment, he looked up again. I wasn't trying to deceive you, but you were hoping I wouldn't look too closely. Michael sighed, maybe. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. Not the confident adult trying to control the outcome of a financial arrangement. Just a son who had made a decision and hoped it would work out without too many complications. Michael, I said softly. Yes, the trust wasn't designed to solve every financial problem. I know, it was designed to protect certain things. Like what security? Michael looked frustrated again. But the family needs security. Yes, and this transfer would help. Possibly. Michael leaned forward. So why refuse it? I looked at him quietly. Because of what you said at dinner. His eyes flickered. You're still holding on to that, yes. Michael shook his head. I told you I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Then what did you mean? He hesitated. Then he spoke slowly. I meant that we've been carrying a lot. Carrying the responsibility of everything. I nodded. And in that moment, you felt I wasn't contributing. Michael didn't answer directly, but he didn't deny it either. That sentence told me something important, I said gently. What it told me how you see me now. Michael looked uncomfortable. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's honest. He looked away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind for days. If the transfer had gone through, Michael looked back at me. What would have happened next? He frowned slightly. What do you mean, would the trust still belong to me? Michael hesitated. Well, technically, yes. Technically, he shifted in his chair. It would be structured differently. How differently, Michael didn't answer. The silence told me everything I needed to know. Because the truth was simpler than any legal language. If I had signed that document, the balance of control would have changed. Not immediately, but eventually. And Michael knew it. I stood slowly from my chair and walked to the window. Outside, the evening sky had turned deep blue. The streetlights were beginning to glow along the sidewalk. Michael, I said quietly. Yes. I've been thinking about something Arthur told me once. What he said, that when people feel entitled to something, they stop recognizing the sacrifices behind it. Michael said nothing. I turned back toward him. For years, your father and I helped whenever you needed support. I know, but somewhere along the way, that help became invisible. Michael's expression tightened. That's not true, isn't it? He looked away again, and in that moment, I realized something. This conversation wasn't about a single document. It was about something much deeper. The difference between gratitude and entitlement. Michael remained in the chair across from me for a long time after that. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The quiet between us wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people finally see each other clearly after years of assumptions. Outside my window, the streetlights had fully illuminated the road. A car passed slowly down the block, its headlights sweeping briefly across the walls of the room. Michael rubbed his hands together again, the same nervous habit he'd had since he was a teenager. You really think I feel entitled? He asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I sat back down across from him. I think I said carefully that life can slowly change how we see things. Michael frowned. What does that mean? It means when responsibilities pile up, when money becomes tight, when stress builds, people start looking for solutions. That's normal. Yes, I said, it is. Michael leaned forward. So I looked for a solution. You did. And you're saying that makes me selfish. I didn't say selfish. Michael's voice rose slightly. But that's what you're implying. I met his eyes calmly. I'm saying you stopped seeing where the help came from. Michael shook his head. I never forgot what you and Dad did for me. Then why did it feel so easy to move those funds without asking me first? Michael opened his mouth, but no words came out. That silence answered the question better than any explanation. Finally, he leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. I didn't think it would hurt you, he admitted. The honesty in that sentence caught me off guard. You didn't think it would hurt me, I repeated. No. Why? Because I thought you trusted me. I do trust you. Michael looked confused. Then what's the problem? The problem, I said gently, is that trust doesn't mean silence. He studied my face. You really would have said no. I might have. Michael laughed quietly. That's exactly why I didn't explain everything. There it was. The truth neither of us had said directly until now. You thought I'd stand in the way I said, yes, and that made it easier to act first and explain later. Michael didn't argue, because he couldn't. For the first time in this entire situation, he looked less defensive and more tired. I didn't plan for things to get this complicated, he said. I believe that. I just wanted to stabilize everything. Your finances. Our finances, he corrected. I smiled slightly. That depends on how you define our... Michael rubbed his temples. You're still thinking about that comment I made. Yes. It was one sentence. Sometimes one sentence tells the whole story. Michael stared at the floor. I shouldn't have said it. No, I was frustrated. I understand that. I didn't mean you were a burden, but you felt it. He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. I stood and walked toward the small dresser where the unsigned authorization document rested. Picking it up, I returned to the chair and placed it gently on the table between us. This piece of paper, I said, represents more than money. Michael looked at it. What does it represent to you, responsibility? Michael frowned. You already have that. Yes. And you're using it to block something that would help. Maybe? Michael's frustration returned. So what happens now? I folded my hands calmly. Now I make a decision. He looked up quickly. You're deciding tonight? Yes. Michael straightened slightly, and I studied him for a moment. In that moment, I saw two different people at once. The man sitting across from me, now stressed, ambitious, desperate to stabilize the life he had built, and the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while Arthur patiently explained fractions. The difference between those two versions of Michael felt enormous, but somewhere deep down they were still the same person. I'm not signing the authorization, I said quietly. Michael's face fell. So that's it, for now. For now. Yes. What does that mean? It means the trust stays exactly the way Arthur designed it. Michael shook his head slowly. You're making a mistake. Maybe. This could solve a lot of problems. It could also create new ones. Michael stood up and began pacing slowly across the room. You don't understand the pressure we're under. Then explain it to me. I tried no. I said gently. You explain the paperwork. Michael stopped pacing. What's the difference? The difference is honesty. Michael stared at me. You think I've been dishonest. I think you've been careful with the truth. He didn't deny it. That more than anything confirmed what I already knew. Finally, Michael stopped pacing and leaned against the wall. So what happens now? He asked again. Now the trust remains unchanged, and the debt, that's something you and Lauren will need to solve. Michael looked frustrated again. You could help. I already have. That was years ago. Yes. Michael gestured toward the house, and now we're trying to keep everything together. I nodded. I know. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and disappointment. So you're just going to watch us struggle. The question hurt more than I expected. But I answered honestly. I'm going to watch you learn something Arthur tried to teach you years ago. Michael frowned. What that security built on someone else's sacrifice doesn't last forever. Michael looked away. The room fell quiet again. Finally, he walked toward the door. Lauren isn't going to like this, he said. That's all right. And what about you? What about me? You're still living here. I held his gaze calmly. Yes. Michael nodded slowly. Well, he said that might get complicated. For the first time since this conversation began, I felt a small sense of clarity, because the situation had finally reached its most honest point. The document remained unsigned, the trust remained intact, and the comfortable illusion Michael and Lauren had been building around the future had suddenly cracked. But what neither of them realized yet was that the real consequences of that crack were only beginning to unfold. The house felt different the next morning. Nothing visible had changed. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and toast. Sunlight filtered through the blinds just as it did every morning, stretching thin lines of gold across the floor. Yet the atmosphere inside the house had shifted. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was awareness. Michael had always believed he understood the structure of things, the house, the finances, the future he was trying to build for his family. But the conversation the night before had introduced a reality he hadn't fully considered, that the foundation of that future wasn't entirely his, and that realization made everything quieter. Lauren spoke very little during breakfast that morning. She moved around the kitchen with the same efficient rhythm as always, but her usual casual conversation had disappeared. Michael barely touched his food.